Waking up early was part of my routine, so when I went out that morning and saw the fence in the middle of my property, I almost spat my coffee out onto the balcony. It was a new fence, treated wood, well-aligned, clearly installed by someone who wanted it to stay there for a long time. And it was right in the middle of my land, as if some god of urban planning had decided to draw an invisible line and declare, "From now on, it's no longer yours." At first, I thought it was a mistake. Perhaps a neighbor had confused the boundaries. It happens, right? After all, I've always owned this land, and who in their right mind would wake up one day and decide they could take over half of someone else's farm? The answer? My neighbor. She had moved in a while ago. She'd bought a modern house built in an old, deforested part of the region, the kind of building that didn't fit in with the countryside. Lots of glass, white fences, a lifeless garden that looked like it had been drawn on Pinterest. He always appeared with a notebook, as if he was inspecting the area to approve or disapprove something. The kind of person who talked about community and rules while trying to shove her own wishes down everyone's throats. And now, apparently, she had decided that half of my farm was hers. I walked over to the fence, touched the wood, and let out a humorless laugh. I was already anticipating the headache. As I followed the fence, the irritation grew. It crossed part of the pasture where my cows used to roam freely, cut across the path I used to take hay to the barn, and ended near the lake, where a considerable chunk of the bank was now on the wrong side. On her side. I climbed into the truck, drove to my lovely neighbor's house, and pulled up in front of the driveway like someone who knows they're in for a long day. When I rang the doorbell, I heard hurried footsteps inside. And then, there she was, with that polite smile that only people who want to screw you over know how to give. I was expecting some absurd excuse, something along the lines of, "That was a mistake," or "The contractor put it in the wrong place." But no, she had prepared for this. "Oh, you came to see the new fence? I'm glad you like it." I felt my eye twitch. Like it? She kept talking as if she were explaining it to a child. She told me that the HOA, Residents Association, which I wasn't part of, by the way, had updated the maps of the community, that the old layout of the properties was out of date, and that, technically, part of my land now belonged to the community, that this fence was just a way of organizing the areas better. I stared at her, waiting for the punchline, but it didn't come. "You just put a fence on my land because you think the maps have changed?" "Well, it's not just a question of thinking," she said, taking out a piece of paper and showing me something printed. "It's all here." I took the paper. I looked at it. I read the words which, in fact, looked like some kind of document, but I'm not stupid. I knew my land, my deed, my boundaries. This woman could print whatever she wanted, but none of that changed the reality. She was trying to rip me off. And the most annoying part? She acted like she was doing me a favor, as if reorganizing my property was a blessing, an improvement in my life. I looked at the fence, then at the paper in my hand, then at her. "Do you really think you can just take a piece of my land and expect me to sit back? Oh, I'm not taking anything. I'm just organizing it. You can continue to use the area, of course. We just need to make sure that the community has access too, you know? For the collective good." The collective good. It was at that moment that I realized that this fight went far, far beyond a simple fence. If I thought that was the worst she could do, I was wrong. Because that was just the beginning. I should have torn down that fence the moment I saw it. But instead, I went home trying to process the absurdity of the situation. Because the idea of a person simply waking up one day and deciding that half of their neighbor's farm now belonged to them was something so insane that it took my brain a while to accept. When I finally did, the anger came on strong. That woman was testing how far she could go, pushing me little by little, trying to see if I would give in. Because if I accepted that fence, the next month would be something else. Maybe she wanted to put a footpath across my pasture. Maybe she would decide that the historic barn, which had been in the family for generations, didn't fit in with the modern look of the neighborhood and should be removed to maintain aesthetics. I don't know how far a person like that can go, but I knew one thing. If I didn't do something now, I'd soon be asked to fill out applications for permission to grow corn on my own land. I took my deed, sat down at the table, and stared at that piece of paper as if it were a shield. My family bought this land decades ago, and now a woman with a notepad and an air of superiority thought she could take it over with a well-aligned fence. I took a deep breath, but every time I remembered the way she smiled and said it was for the collective good, I wanted to pick up a sledgehammer and take matters into my own hands. The next morning, I went to the local registry office to check on any absurd updates that might have happened without my knowledge. If this woman had some kind of crazy document saying that my land now belonged to the community, then I wanted to see for myself. The woman from the notary's office looked at me like she knew I was there because of some bullshit from the Residents Association. Because it wasn't that long ago that these people thought they could change rules out of the blue for sheer convenience. But when she pulled up the records and confirmed that there had been absolutely no official change to the boundaries of my property, I felt a momentary sense of relief. At least, legally, my land was still mine. I just needed to convince a stubborn woman that real laws and rules were worth more than the scribbles she printed out and claimed were up-to-date maps. I picked up the documents, thanked the lady at the registry office, and left the place determined to put an end to this nonsense. I climbed into the truck and drove straight to the woman's house. I knocked on the door, and this time, I didn't even wait for her to play dumb. I threw the papers in front of her and said it slowly to see if she understood this time. The fence needs to come down. You can't just change the boundaries of my property because you think you can. She picked up the papers, gave them a cursory glance, and let out a theatrical sigh, as if I was being a nuisance. I expected you to react like that, but it's only a matter of time. Soon the updates will be formalized, and everything will be in the community's name. So you'd better get used to the idea. I felt a chill run down my spine, because that meant that this woman not only believed her own lie, but was also moving around behind the scenes, trying to make this change somehow official. She wasn't just playing boss of the neighborhood, she really thought she could take someone's land and convince the bureaucrats to rubber stamp the decision. I took a deep breath, kept myself from sending her to that place, and got straight to the point. There's no such thing as just a matter of time. The deed is clear. This land is mine. If the fence doesn't come down, I'll tear it down. And if I have to, I'll take it to court. She laughed. That debauched laugh that made me realize that this woman had no intention of resolving this civilly. I don't know if you've noticed, but people here like the idea of the fence. You seem to be the only one complaining. And if you go to court, you might find that the opinion of the community carries a lot of weight when it comes to these disputes. I wanted to explode at that moment, but I knew there was no point. I could scream. I could throw that paper in her face and tear down the fence with my bare hands, but none of that was going to work. This woman was the kind of person who made everything look official, with printed documents and small talk behind the scenes. I needed to act smarter. I went home and started calling everyone I knew who could help. Old neighbors, friends, people who knew about laws and bureaucracy. If this woman thought she could make my property disappear with a play on words, I was going to show her that I knew how to play, too. The next day, I was at the registry office again, this time to officially register a notice against any attempt to change the records of my property. I also contacted a lawyer who specialized in such matters, because if this woman really did have influential friends, I was going to need someone who knew how to dismantle this nonsense before it took root. Meanwhile, she continued to act as if she had won, walking around the neighborhood, telling everyone what a success the new community organization was, how the fence was just the beginning of a new phase for the residents, how it was all a great collective victory. And every time I saw her parading around with that little smile of someone who had already gotten what they wanted, my anger only grew, because I knew it wasn't over yet, and that the worst was yet to come. Deep down, I knew that this story wasn't going to end with a simple exchange of papers and bureaucratic threats. This woman wasn't the type to give up just because the law said she was wrong. In her mind, if she managed to convince the right people, if she repeated her lie with enough conviction, at some point, it would come true. And that's exactly what she was trying to do. While I was gathering documents and talking to lawyers, she was spreading her side of the story to anyone who would listen. The first thing I noticed was a change in the attitude of the neighbors. Some of them, people I'd never had a problem with, suddenly started looking at me funny. The kind of look that says there's some gossip about you going around, but nobody wants to tell you directly. Because, of course, this woman had managed to turn a dispute over my property into a major community drama. Now I wasn't just the guy fighting a ridiculous fence. Now I was the selfish one, who refused to collaborate with the improvement of the neighborhood, the one who was trying to stop progress. It wasn't long before I started hearing absurdities. They said that I had promised to sell part of my land and was now backtracking, that I was holding on to space that could be used for something useful, like a play area for the children, as if I had a moral obligation to give up half my farm so that people could have picnics and play frisbee, and, of course, the best one of all, that I was only doing it to cause trouble, because I was angry with the HOA from the start and wanted to see chaos ensue. But the worst part wasn't even the gossip. It was when the little provocations started. First, it was the mail. Some of my bills stopped arriving. I had to go after the companies to find out that there had been errors in my delivery details, errors that had never happened before. Then it was the garbage. The week after our last conversation, my garbage can simply disappeared. I went to HOA headquarters to ask if they knew anything, and the answer was a shrug followed by a, "Oh, maybe it was picked up by mistake." And then the little attacks turned into something more aggressive, because apparently it wasn't enough for this woman to try to rewrite reality to make my land hers. She also wanted to make me pay for refusing to accept her theater. One morning, I woke up to a strange noise outside, a metallic sound of something dragging on the ground. I went out to have a look and almost couldn't believe my eyes. My gate, which had always been there, had been ripped off and thrown aside, as if it had been removed to make way for something. I looked around, trying to understand what was happening, and then I saw the trail of marks on the ground, tire tracks going straight into the fenced area. I took the truck and drove to the fence, my head boiling with rage, and there they were, a group of workers unloading sacks of cement and wood, as if they were about to build something on top of my property. And who was coordinating it all? The woman herself. I stood there for a second, trying to decide whether to explode for good or first try to understand what excuse she was going to come up with this time. But before I could open my mouth, she came walking towards me with that smile of someone who thinks they're always in control. "Ah, you're just in time. Would you like to take a look at the plans?" She said it as if she were inviting me to help her choose the decorations for a barbecue, and not to watch as she invaded my land and started erecting something without any permission. "What plans?" Her smile got even wider, as if she was just waiting for this question. "The community park, of course. We decided that this space would be perfect for a living area, with benches, trails, maybe even a small playground for the children. Isn't it great to see the community coming together to create something so beautiful?" The audacity of this woman was so great that for a second I was speechless. Not only had she surrounded my property, not only had she spread lies and manipulated public opinion, now she was trying to actually build something there, as if I didn't even exist, as if my ownership of the land was just an insignificant detail in her grand project of neighborhood dictator. I took a deep breath, because I knew that if I lost control there, she would play the victim, as if I were a monster for not wanting to donate my piece of land for the sake of the little children who didn't even exist in that damned condominium. "This has to stop now. This is my land. You can't just bring in workers and start building here without my permission." She sighed theatrically, as if she were dealing with a stubborn child. "It's only a matter of time. We've already filed an application to update the maps, and soon everything will be official. You're fighting something inevitable. Why don't you accept it and join us instead of fighting?" At that moment, I knew she wasn't going to back down. No matter how much I protested or how logically I tried to argue, this woman was determined to make this lie come true, and she was willing to do anything to do it. I returned home feeling my blood boil, because now it was no longer a question of bureaucracy or neighborly disputes. This woman was trying to erase me from the very land where I was born and raised. If it was war she wanted, then it was war she was going to have. At that moment, I realized that I had gone beyond what was reasonable. It wasn't just a fence anymore. It wasn't just a nosy neighbor trying to push an absurd rule on the neighborhood. She had declared war and was playing dirty. She was trying to wear me down, tire me out, force me to give in, because she knew that if I did that, even once, she would have won, and nothing would stop her from continuing to expand her influence like a parasite spreading through my farm, the neighborhood, and anything else she thought should be under her control. But I wasn't going to back down. That afternoon, I made 3 calls, first to my lawyer, informing him that the woman had progressed from pure nonsense to concrete action. She was literally trying to build on my land, as if it were her own. Second, to the local sheriff, because, as far as I knew, there was no law saying that you could just wake up and decide to build a park on someone else's farm. And thirdly, to a contractor I knew who wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. I asked him how much he would charge to remove a fence. No questions asked. And then I waited. It took a few hours, but when the police arrived, she was there, in the middle of the workers, pointing out where she wanted the benches and tracks to be placed, as if she owned the place. When she saw the car pull up, her face lit up for a second, as if she thought someone had called her to make sure I didn't get in the way of her big project. But her expression soon changed when the officers got off and came straight to me. I explained the situation, showed them my deed, explained that this woman had not only fenced in my property, but was now trying to rip me off and build something without my permission. The policeman looked at the papers, looked at the construction, looked at her, and said that it had to stop immediately. And it was at that moment that I saw the sparkle in her eyes change. For the first time since all this started, she wasn't in control of the situation, and she knew it. She tried to argue, to say that the HOA had approved it, that the maps would be updated, that it was only a matter of time. But the cops weren't buying it. I don't know if she expected me to just swallow this story like everyone else in the neighborhood, or if she really believed her own lie. But the truth was one. She was committing a crime, and now she had to deal with the consequences. The sheriff warned her that if the workers didn't leave immediately, and if any other attempt was made to continue the construction, she would be arrested for trespassing, not to mention the civil suit I was already preparing against her. And then came the most beautiful scene I had ever seen. The workers packing up quickly, carrying cement, wood, tools, as if they had just realized that they were taking part in something illegal and wanted nothing to do with it. She stood there, watching everything crumble around her, as if she couldn't understand how her great masterpiece had been brought down so quickly, as if it was impossible that someone had dared to challenge her vision for the community. But I wasn't finished. The next day, I took my truck, drove to the fence, and waited for my contractor to arrive. He came with his team and, without a single word, they began to dismantle the thing, stake by stake, ripping out every piece of wood until there was nothing left. Each hammering, each nail removed, was a small victory, like pulling a tumor out of your skin. Seeing the fence being destroyed was the most satisfying thing I'd experienced in a long time. She showed up in the middle of the removal, shouting, threatening, saying that it was an outrage, that I couldn't just dismantle something that the community wanted, that she was going to file a complaint against me. But nobody there gave a damn what she said. My contractor continued to tear everything down. Her workers were no longer there to help her, and the few neighbors who had been convinced of her version began to move away, realizing that perhaps They were on the wrong side of history. By the end of the day, the fence was gone, and what did exist was a great silence on her part. I knew she wouldn't accept it quietly, but at that moment, I had won. And if she tried anything again, I'd be ready. The following week, my lawyer informed me that the case was officially being opened for trespassing and property damage, as well as a court order guaranteeing that she would never try to move the boundaries of my land again. And then the news reached the neighborhood. Neighbors who had previously turned up their noses at me now started whispering about her. The woman who tried to steal a piece of the farm, who built an illegal fence, who was almost arrested for her own arrogance. The people who once treated her like a leader began to realize that she was nothing more than a lunatic with a thirst for control. And like any dictator without followers, her power began to crumble, and that I would never let it happen again. When I saw the for sale sign in front of her house, I finally allowed myself to smile, because, at the end of the day, she was the one who got kicked out of her own territory. And finally, don't forget to comment and leave a like.